Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian here, D3 Topics Gamer, here to share with you another one of my worst best ranking videos. And this time I'll be doing my own personal ranking of mainly the much more updated versions of the Prince of Persia series. Now, this series has been around for a while, but for this particular list, I'm mainly just focusing on the last 5 games, starting from the rebooted series, which start with the Sands of Time era. So these 5 games are Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, Warrior Within, The Two Thrones, the 2008 reboot, and then the last Prince of Persia game that actually came out, which is Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sand. Now, there has been some update that the remake of the Sands of Time game is still coming out. It just got like a new developer, so I felt like this would be just a good time to give my own personal ranking of these 5 games. So if you do happen to enjoy this list by the end, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Keep track of me in my future videos. And if you have any great ideas you think would make for great ranking videos, be sure to share those ideas with me in the comments down below, and I will be sure to give you a shout out. So this list is definitely going to be a bit, I don't want to say controversial, but I think it'll be a bit more different than other ranking of these 5 games that I have seen. And I am sticking strictly to the console versions. I will not be including any of the handheld games. So, starting off with number 5. And one more thing before I start. I think all of these games rank from good to just amazing. I don't think any of these games are bad, even though there's some entries I think that a lot of people dislike more than others, but this is just my list. So starting off, my least favorite entry is with going to shock a lot of people. And my least favorite Prince of Persia game has to go to Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones. Now, this was actually the conclusion to the Sands of Time trilogy, or was supposed to be a trilogy, and comes after the events of Warrior Within. Now, I think that story-wise, it without question did a fantastic job of giving us a satisfying conclusion to the Sands of Time story arc. My issue is that I think that a lot of the platforming, a lot of the game mechanics that were reused from, say, Warrior Within and even going back to Sands of Time had gotten a little too old and I don't think had been improved enough. And on top of that, they added a couple of extra gameplay elements, like being able to ride chariots. I didn't really think all that enjoyable. But my biggest flaw that I have with this game is simply playing as the Dark Prince. Now, in this game, you have the prince have to switch between his normal state and being able to play as the Dark Prince. Now, this kind of had the same somewhat effect that I had when it comes to playing as like Nero from Devil May Cry 4 and then playing as Dante, in the form that between the two characters, in say like something in Devil May Cry 4, I prefer to play as Dante because it's not only harder, it's much more challenging than playing as Nero, which the game feels just ridiculously easy. And that's how I feel about this game. When I play as the Prince, it feels much more familiar, but a little dated. But when I play as the Dark Prince, the game is just ridiculously easy. Now, I guess it's supposed to be easy because the Dark Prince is like so much more powerful because his sword pretty much becomes like this really cool whip. But when you do that, it just loses its challenge factor at all. And at that point, enemies just don't feel like anything to you. Now, maybe that's supposed to play on how powerful the Dark Prince really is, but when you have one side of the Prince in his normal state, that it's really not even all that fun to play as him, and then you have the other side of him as the Dark Prince, which it's just game feels ridiculously easy. You just have a feeling that the game isn't as difficult as it needs to be. Now, that's pretty common for games that are supposed to end trilogies, because if your first 2 installments are as awesome as Sands of Time and Warrior Within were, it's really, really difficult to kind of stick to landing in all of the main departments. In terms of gameplay, visuals, storytelling, sound, soundtrack, it's difficult to land all those different departments, and I just don't think that the Two Thrones managed to do that. Now, again, I think the ending was perfect. It was exactly the type of ending we needed to close that era. But I think the gameplay, at least for me, was a little bit lacking, which is why, unfortunately, it is my least favorite Prince of Persia game in this primary series of games that I am ranking. Going on to number 4 is certainly going to maybe not surprise too many people, but I would have to give it to Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands. Now, this was actually the last Prince of Persia game to actually be released, and this is the only one, the last one that actually came out during the HD period. Now, surprisingly, The Forgotten Sands is supposed to take place within the period of the Sands of Time era, as it takes place between Warrior Within and Sands of Time, which is weird because if you played those first 3 games and know how the story goes, it kind of requires you to forget a lot of really, really important things that happen within those two games, or supposed to be happening, but is supposed to be kind of familiar, which is makes it kind of a weird story. Now, the story pretty much takes place after the events of Sands of Time, and the prince is visiting his brother who is attacking a certain city, and he unleashes some dangerous power which causes a whole bunch of sand creatures to appear, and because he's had previous experience with this kind of situation, he is there to kind of fix the entire situation and undo all of the terrible things that have happened due to this power that's been unleashed. Now, the one thing I will say without question is that out of all the Prince of Persia games, I think within the Sands of Time era, I think that the Forgotten Sands is without question the best looking one. Which it makes sense because within the Sands of Time era, this is the only one that takes place in the HD period. And I think that it did a great job of actually redoing the combat system. It does not feel at all like Sands of Time, Warrior Within, and Two Thrones, which can be a good and bad thing depending on how you feel about the actual combat. Now, the combat was actually much more straightforward hack and slash and wasn't quite as technical as the older games do. And while that feels good at first, this gets dangerously repetitive by the time you get to the end of the game, because at that point, the game is throwing. The main difference between what they did with Forbidden Sands or Forgotten Sands and the main trilogy of Sands of Time is that you couldn't just hack and slash. You actually had to be kind of much more maneuvering. You had to use your environment, and therefore it took a little bit more time to get through enemies. And this one, they throw so many enemies that it basically becomes like a straightforward hack and slash game. And while that can be challenging early on, that challenge factor certainly decreases greatly by the end. And the enemies never at once increase their difficulty. It just becomes kind of rinse and repeat. I will say that in terms of using the use of time and mechanics with the gameplay, I think this game also has the best platforming of all of the Sands of Time games. It gives you a lot of new powers that allows you to use platforming in a different way, which it allows you to like freeze bodies of water. It allows you to kind of like shoot to a certain point. And so you were given way more abilities than you've ever had in any of the main series in the Sands of Time era. But I just think that the story just kind of messing with continuity and not feeling needed, and the difficulty seriously going down towards you get to the end of the game really kind of hurts this game in the long run, which is why a lot of people do consider this to be their least favorite, or at least one of their least favorite entries in the Prince of Persia series, and I perfectly understand why. And while I still have fun with this game, I do openly acknowledge its flaws, which is why it's number 4 on my list. Now, number 3 on my list is probably the most divisive Prince of Persia game of all time, and I completely understand why. But it has to go to the 2008 reboot simply titled Prince of Persia. Now, after the conclusion of the Two Thrones, they decided to reboot the series with an entirely new, different story that is completely independent and is a one-off game. They never made a sequel to this, and so it pretty much has to live and die on only one game. And I think realistically, it did a pretty good job of being different and having its own identity. Now, this is going to be weird because I think visually, this is an incredibly beautiful game because it felt to me like more of a painting. And the story has you play as a prince, we think, who wanders onto a mystic land, and he runs into this girl named Elika who has these unique powers, and together they have to pretty much purify this like hidden city of this corruption. And throughout the entire game they have to work together because the prince needs to protect Elika, but Elika actually has the power to cure the corruption, and there are all these dark creatures that they have to work together. Now, I think the combat system, the gameplay, is really what helps this game stand out because the prince and Elika operate as a main tag team. Their attacks and their ability to move around the environment requires them to work together very, very carefully. And even the story has them spending the entirety of the time together. And so these two characters have to have great chemistry. And I think that by the end, they absolutely do have great chemistry. And it also helps that the main character, the prince, is actually voiced by Nolan North from the Uncharted series. So I think he did a fantastic job playing as the prince in this game. Now, where I think a lot of people don't like this game is because there is so much more platforming. It's fair to say that the majority of this game is purely platforming. Now, this kind of works in my opinion because this game is not linear like all the other Prince of Persia games in terms of they're pretty straightforward. This one is kind of open world, so you can actually choose which specific area of the city you want to explore first and purify. And that gives you a lot of options. And there's a lot more exploring. There's a lot more secrets in this game. I just think that the fact that, like, I'd say, like, 75% of this is purely platforming. And you'll get new abilities for Elika, which allows you to be able to travel through your environments in different ways. And the same thing goes with combat. And even some boss fights. Now, one of the most unique properties that to this day is still surprising to me is that this is probably the only game that you cannot die. You cannot lose. There is no game over screen. Like, even if you jump off a cliff, Elika will just dive and come get you. If you're about to get killed by an enemy, she just fires a blast and like gives you a little bit of health. But this is like the only game I've ever played that you cannot legitimately lose. Even if you put the controller down and don't do anything and let the enemies come at you, she'll keep protecting you, which I like. It makes it unique. It makes it stand out from just about any other game I've ever played. And I think that some of the visuals are just beautiful. I like the environment. I like the music. I just like how different it is and the fact that it did a great job of having its own identity. Now, mind you, this feels so different that you either love or hate this game. But heck, I'm one of the few individuals that can say that, yeah, it is very much different from the Sands of Time. It doesn't feel anything like the Sands of Time era. And even its combat system is not nearly as technical. And it is really based upon a lot of blocking and parrying and timing your attacks. So you have to be a lot more careful with your offense. And I think that, again, helps to have its own identity, which is why I'm not ashamed to say that this is, I'd say, a great game. And I've had a lot of fun playing this. And I've played it several times, which is why it's number 3 on my list. And heck, I'm not ashamed to say that. Going with number 2 is the game that really started this major reboot, and that is Prince of Persia Sands of Time. Now, this game was revolutionary when it came out. Now, the Prince of Persia franchise had been there. It had been present, but it had been kind of old. But Ubisoft was able to kind of revitalize this franchise and add a whole bunch of different mechanics and elements and gameplay styles and visuals, and it made it probably one of the most innovative games that we've ever played. I think mechanic-wise, combat was just fine. Platforming was amazing. But the use of using the Sands of Time with the dagger to actually rewind gameplay is something that up until that point, I don't think anyone had ever seen. And it did a masterful job. I mean, just the amount of time that you could actually replay gameplay that you just did was amazing. I think that the environments were great. I thought that the story progression was amazingly handled, and the characters, there aren't many characters, but I think that the balance between combat and platforming was very well handled. And heck, it's even visually still looks pretty good today, which is why I'm curious to see what they do with this remake when it eventually comes out. But this game was a cornerstone. It did a lot of things that really helped give the Prince of Persia the type of energy it needed to be a first-class franchise. And heck, started the works, which is why it's number 2 on my list. Number 1, and my favorite Prince of Persia game of all time, has to go to Prince of Persia Warrior Within. Now, this game takes place after the events of Sands of Time, obviously, and has you take control of the prince. Now, after he completely fixed the situation with the Sands of Time in the first game, he ends up being chased by this creature who I don't want to spoil, that pretty much is trying to come after him the entire game, and the prince is really just trying to find a solution to the situation. Now, this is where I think every single aspect of Prince of Persia was really at its best. It took everything that you had in the first game and just elevated it. The combat feels very familiar, but seriously upgraded. You now can not only fight enemies in different ways, you can actually pick up their weapons and use them. You don't necessarily need the Dagger of Time anymore as a secondary weapon, and that makes combat feel so much more refreshing. The puzzles are a lot harder. The platforming is a lot more challenging. It really requires precise movements in order to get through. And the fact that while you're playing this game, you have this demon, this monster, constantly pop up and chase you, gives it kind of a Resident Evil Nemesis feeling. So you could just be minding your own business, just exploring. But the second you hear his theme going, you know that things are about to go down and you need to get out of there. And those chase sequences are heart pounding. You know things are serious because there is no real way to fight this creature. And I think that added some of the best aspects that really helped the werewolf stand out. I think that the story was very well handled. I think the visuals were great. And I think that the fact that it was M-rated allowed it to take some of the elements of Persia to a department that I wasn't really expecting would work as well as it did. But that was just a quick list of things. That's why I think that Warrior Within is by far my favorite entry. Plus, it had a really kick-ass soundtrack. And I had no idea, I wouldn't have expected that they would make Godsmack's I Stand Alone the primary theme song for the game, just like it was for the Rock Scorpion King movie, which, that was a welcome treat. But that's just another reason why Prince of Persia, The Warrior Within is my favorite Prince of Persia game of all time. So that was my ranking of the 5 primary Prince of Persia games that I have played. If you happen to have had a chance to play these 5 games, how would you rank them? Share your list with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I will see you next time.